While standing in her brightly illuminated bathroom, Jessica Williams listened to music that provided a calming background to the with steam rising from her just-drawn bath. The room felt like a haven and a relief. Her husband Mark had departed early from the reverberating quiet of her suburban home in Mon Hills. That morning, while on yet another business trip, his absence seemed more pervasive than his actual presence. Jessica had been used to living alone and had established rituals for her days. She tugged her sash, and those blended together like pages in a worn book. The silk robe was pulled tighter around her, the silky material grazing her skin as she lit a vanilla-scented candle and, for a few periods, let herself take a deep breath, her thoughts drifting to the weight of years spent overseeing a basic, undisturbed bath. As she slipped a toe into the warm water, the sense of loneliness in the household appeared to lift. The warmth beckoning her to forget her concerns, followed by the quiet creak of the Jessica froze at the front door, not expecting anyone, and Mark had made it clear that her heart raced as she strained to hear him say he would be gone until the weekend. She dismissed the idea over the soft music on her phone, supposing it was the breeze, or maybe, despite her neighbor's cat's reputation for roaming around her porch, the sound of when Jessica heard quiet footsteps in the hallway, her heart leaped to her throat. Curiosity and panic mixed as she emerged from the tub, her feet gently tapping the cool silk tiles. As she looked out into the dark corridor, her breath caught between caution and the dampness of her robe, she questioned whether to call out her unreasonable hope that she was imagining things. If someone was there, shouldn't they make an announcement? Her palm was lingering over the doorframe as the footfall increased. Louder, steady, and leisurely, which contrasted sharply with her heart's thundering beat, and suddenly, as she was ready to, he was Nathan, her stepson, and she reached for her phone as the bathroom door opened. Stood in the doorway, his face framed by the bright afternoon light in a painting of shock and regret. His athletic physique was frozen in the doorway, his tousled brown hair still wet from the rain outside. Jessica's initial reaction, if he were caught in a moment, was to tighten the robe over her, but this just served to highlight the silks that clung to her curves, burning her cheeks as she came to understand how vulnerable she felt, both emotionally and physically. An adrenaline rush went through her veins when she was taken by surprise like this. Nathan's jaw widened as she snatched a towel from the rack and gasped, her voice quivering. "What are you doing here?" As though the response were lodged in his throat, he closed his eyes and quickly looked away. "I didn't believe anyone was," he stumbled home, his rich voice tinged with shame. "I stopped by to get my—" I didn't mean for the words to fall out of his mouth, but Jim bagged. Jessica's thoughts were racing, repeating the scene in vivid detail just as his eyes had, and she could hardly notice them. Automatically focused on hers, and his eyes briefly shifted downward before he glanced away, his cheeks reddening. Her own response was just as disturbing, a complex jumble of outrage and something much more nuanced than she couldn't or wouldn't name it. "But it's okay," she continued in a stern voice. Meant to simply knock the next time, but Nathan nodded and quickly retreated from the room as if fleeing a crime scene. Jessica stood and said, "Sorry, I'll go." The towel gripped her chest like steel for a little minute while she listened. Her legs felt weak and her breath was shallow as she heard his retreating footsteps. She saw her face flushed in the mirror as she sought to balance herself against the bathroom counter. The woman was staring back at her with wide eyes and moist hair stuck to her temples. Was a somebody she hardly knew who had been rocked by more than a traumatic experience. She fell on the tub's edge, the steam now releasing into the room's tight air. Her thoughts were a whirlpool of contradicting feelings, telling herself that it was all an accident. But it became more difficult for her to persuade herself that it was insignificance. There was a ghost of a moment that refused to go away concerning the way Nathan had gazed at her. Jessica drained the bath water and extinguished the lamp, forcing herself to remain motionless. She had to get over this in order to put the occurrence under the pressure of normality, though she couldn't help but notice Nathan's cologne's subtle, lingering aroma as she entered the corridor. The remainder of the afternoon went by, either in the air or in the way her heart raced at the prospect of seeing him again. Jessica busied herself with housework while in a daze, folding clothing and scouring areas that didn't require cleaning. No amount of distraction could erase the memory of that moment, but it wasn't only the needless precision. The severity of the manner in which it had shocked was the shame that persisted. Like a flame igniting dry kindling, she was able to escape the routine of her days. Jessica felt like a coiled spring by the time dinner arrived, with every sound amplified and every action purposeful. When Nathan returned to the kitchen, the tension was almost palpable in his hesitant steps. Uncomfortable, they both avoided leaving the subject hanging while exchanging courteous but awkward comments. Never before had Mark's absence felt so obvious, like a black cloud separating them. A stark reminder of everything Jessica had attempted to ignore was the chair at the table. About her life, Jessica said as Nathan eventually withdrew to his room. The relief was brief, but she hadn't known she'd been holding her breath. The home felt more burdened, and the quiet was no longer consoling, but oppressive. As she went to bed that evening, her thoughts would not stop. Her skin prickled as she relived every moment of the meeting with clarity. She gazed at the ceiling, her mind racing as she attempted to understand her own emotions. Was it guilt? It had cracked, whether it was shame or something more serious that she wasn't prepared to face. Something opened inside of her that she was no longer able to identify. Disregard, and as she eventually fell asleep, one idea remained, weighing heavily and unavoidably. If Jessica believed that this was only a brief awkward moment, what would happen next? When she was mistaken, what happened next would put her fundamental foundations to the test. Meticulously planned existence, revealing feelings and limits she never. Jessica Williams woke up the next morning to the warm California sun shining through the bridge she had dreamed of crossing. Her bedroom window, but its golden glow, could not soothe her. Felt constricted, her thoughts still entangled in the previous day's events, the recollection of Nathan appeared as vivid as if it had just occurred as he stood in the toilet doorway. His eyes opened, his cheeks flushed quickly, and there was a tight tension that Jessica's movements filled the air between them as she got out of bed. She put her robe around herself slowly and deliberately, as if each step took more work than usual, but this at one point, the silk that had felt luxurious turned into a brittle barrier. With the exception of the little sound of a breeze rustling the trees outside, the house was eerily quiet. Mark had texted late the evening before a quick, indifferent message regarding a lengthy trip departing. Jessica tried to steel herself, she told herself, as Nathan came down the stairs. It had been a straightforward error, a moment of awkwardness that would pass, but she knew deep down that something had shifted in the house. There was an unseen weight in the air that she couldn't get rid of. Nathan was already in the kitchen, leaning against the counter and holding a mug of coffee when she walked in. When she entered, his head jerked up, and their eyes briefly locked, before he quickly averted his gaze. His voice was unusually quiet in the morning, and Jessica's response was forceful. She distracted herself by making herself a cup of coffee, not feeling the need to grin back to him as she tried to keep the conversation between them casual. They were intolerable, extending like an unseen chasm, and Jessica's thoughts were racing. For a statement or anything to ease the discomfort, but every idea felt. She finally asked in an incredibly forced and fake manner, "How do you sleep?" Nathan's response was hesitant and curt, "And you turned, Jessica." She turned to face him, her hands clutching the counter's edge as though for support. The words lingered in the air, their ambiguity serving as a barrier and a great deal on my mind. Following an admission, Nathan's gaze briefly lifted to hers, and there was something in his eyes as his casual detachment mask slipped. Jessica was unable to identify uncertainty, guilt, and another thing. Nathan shuddered as she started to quiver in her voice, "Take it any more about yesterday?" "It's okay, we don't need to discuss it, but perhaps we ought to hear Jessica's voice," before his head abruptly cut her off. Firmer now, Nathan said, "It was just an awkward moment, nothing more, right?" He spoke hurriedly, his tone betraying him, as the mug clinked against the coffee as he poured it down with a bit too much force. "I apologize for interrupting her, I knew Jessica had done it." Nathan nodded, saying, "It's okay, let's just move on," but the tenseness in Jessica's shoulders didn't help, and she could sense a knot in her stomach that tighter with each second that went by. She turned away, concentrating on her coffee as though the rest of the day went by in stops and turns with Jessica, but the act of stirring would somehow calm her anxiety. And Nathan, cautiously dodging one another in the cramped house, Jessica attempted to dive into tasks like cleaning counters and moving bookshelves in an attempt to divert her attention, but each time her heart would rush if she heard Nathan's footsteps or caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of her eye. By late afternoon, Jessica was folding laundry in the living room with an uncontrollable mechanical precision that did little to ease her anxiety, the monotonous routine of folding towels and putting on socks lulling her into a tenuous sense of normalcy, when Nathan came in. She needs assistance since his presence is shattering the brittle bubble she had built around herself. He questioned in a hesitant tone, and Jessica paused, her hands folding halfway before she responded, finally. Nathan took a seat on the couch and reached for a stack of garments after hearing her hesitant tone. Initially worked in quiet, with only the gentle rustle of fabric as a sound, but the silence wasn't cozy, rather, it bore down on Jessica, making her intensely conscious of each motion, each look when their hands touched a t-shirt. She hurriedly withdrew her palm, thinking Nathan wouldn't notice, but she felt a jolt, a spark of something she couldn't ignore. She could see that he had a wrinkled brow as she looked at him. His lips parted slightly as though he were going to say something, but the words Nathan remarked, "Didn't you come okay?" After a lengthy pause, his voice full with a mix of worry and something unsaid, Jessica spoke too hastily. Nathan didn't press, but his eyes lingered as her voice betrayed how exhausted she was. Jessica stood suddenly as his eyes searched hers for something she wasn't prepared to offer. Gathering I should put them away, she remarked, folding the clothing into a tidy stack. Jessica felt as though she was suffocating beneath the weight of her own thoughts as she moved down the corridor. Her mind was racing with thoughts she dared not ask, and her pulse was irregular. Why did Nathan's presence feel so different and charged that night, and why couldn't she get the restroom out of her mind? The air was pleasant, and there were stars in the sky as Jessica sat by herself on the back porch with a glass of wine. She had hoped that the silence would soothe her, but instead it only made her internal turmoil worse, like tiny pinpricks of light. She considered Mark's absence to be both a relief and a cause of guilt. Of Nathan's presence, which she believed filled the voids Mark left, of herself caught in the midst of an unexpected storm when Jessica's heart skipped a beat when he joined her on the porch. He was holding a beer, and his feet were tentative. Whispered softly, "Will you mind if I sit?" Jessica pointed to the vacant chair next to her. "Proceed." They sat quietly for a while, listening to as night fell between them. Jessica sensed Nathan's gaze on her, and his countenance was unreadable when she eventually turned to face him. "Nathan, you seem different." Finally, he spoke in a quiet voice, as if you were carrying something heavy, but Jessica didn't know how to react, so she turned her head aside and clenched her fingers around the stem of her wineglass. Nathan leaned forward with his elbows resting on his chest as her words lacked conviction. He said, "Knees, if you ever want to talk about it," but he eventually left. Jessica didn't respond because she couldn't handle the weight of the offer that was hanging in the air. Unspoken words pressed down on her, making it difficult for her to breathe. Instruct him to go back inside and give her some room, but she chose to. She sat there with a flurry of feelings racing through her head that she was unable to identify, let alone the night seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of something. Help ease the tension, but Jessica couldn't get rid of the notion that something would change next. Everything was quiet as the dusk settled over the Monner Hills. Jessica Williams' house was filled with simmering tension, and the warm amber light of the tidy areas where she had spent the day were lit by lamps in the living room, perfecting the lavender cleaner's aroma, which persisted in the air and concealed she stood at the kitchen sink, gazing at the chaos that was simmering beneath the surface. As she washed her hands, the rushing water did little to muffle the sound coming from her reflection in the window. Remember that earlier that morning, Mark had departed on another business trip. As casual as usual, yet his absence was more noticeable this time. Jessica attempted to ignore the idea, telling herself that it was just the loneliness that comes with having a house vacant, but the truth was like a darkness hanging over her. Nathan, her stepson, was upstairs, and his presence was an unsaid burden from which she was unable to free herself. From every floorboard creak above, every slight echo of his actions made her realize that they were by themselves. The day had gone by in tense stillness, the kind that craved recognition but got none. Jessica had stayed as far away from Nathan as she could, keeping herself occupied with assignments that demanded all of her focus but didn't yield the results she had hoped for. Diversion, but as the evening grew darker, she became restless and began to pace the kitchen as though it were moving. A little thud from upstairs interrupted the tension coiling in her chest. Jessica's heart quickened as she turned her head toward the ceiling. Nothing, she reminded herself, simply Nathan moving around, but the sound had caused a little tremor in her that radiated through her meticulously manicured exterior. She used a dish towel to wipe her hands before placing it down with purpose. The initial sip of the wine she took before pouring herself a glass was harsh, nearly acrid, but it temporarily grounded her. Jessica leaned against the counter and gazed at the candle as it flickered. She had lit it earlier in the evening, and the wine on her breath combined with the subtle vanilla aroma to create a thick concoction. She closed her eyes in the hopes that the tension in her shoulder would subside, but it persisted. That just seemed to heighten her senses. As if she were a second skin, the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs caused her eyes to break out of Jessica's hold. As she turned to face the doorway, the wine glass tightened, and a second later Nathan emerged, his unkempt hair, and he paused when he saw her in his casual clothes, which revealed his inability to sleep. She was unable to sleep, and his black eyes met hers with a pause that made her stomach turn. He asked as his voice was raspy and low, as though he had been reflecting on his own thoughts. Jessica shook her head and forced a tiny smile, saying, "No, I'm just restless." I suppose Nathan nodded before moving farther into the space with a sort of he gestured, his presence filling the room in a way that was both reassuring and unsettling. Jessica paused for a moment as she considered joining you at the wine bottle on the counter. Nathan followed her instructions for a few seconds before nodding and making sure to fetch a glass. The sound of glass clinking on granite broke the stillness as he generously poured himself some, moving slowly. As though to delay the inevitable, he sat down at the tiny kitchen table. They sat opposite from one another, with her own wine glass still in hand. Table of a temporary, brittle barrier between them. The stillness stretched like a tightrope as neither of them spoke. Why? Jessica looked at Nathan's face, his features more pronounced in the low light. Was a slight furrow between his eyebrows and a tenseness in his jaw that suggested the Nathan remarked, "It's strange, isn't it, that his thoughts are racing behind his serene exterior?" Jessica tilted her head when his voice abruptly broke the silence, and he peered up at her, his expression enigmatic. Pretending to be perplexed by the presence of simply the her breath caught, "But she feels different from the two of us." Swiftly covered it up with a glass of wine, I guess. When she spoke in a neutral tone, Nathan sat back in his chair and swirled the wine in his glass. He kept looking at her, trying to find something she had been wondering if she wanted him to locate her. Jessica's stomach knotted at her hold on the wine glass the other day. She forced herself to meet his gaze as she tightened and carefully placed it on the table. "Gaze, Nathan, we don't have to." I am aware that he cut off his voice abruptly, but cruel, but I can't deny it happened, and I doubt you can either. Jessica's heart pounded so loudly that she was certain he could hear it. She opened her mouth to reply, but the weight prevented her from saying anything. His voice and the intensity of his look were too near to the truth. Nathan hesitated, "But she had been avoiding me. I don't want things to get strange between us. You are more essential to me than you are." His fingers are clenching on his glass. Likely understood that his remark's vulnerability took her by surprise and softened the edges of her anxiety. Jessica felt her determination faltering and the barriers she had erected around herself starting to crumple as she extended her hand across the table and touched his. Was brief, but it was plenty to give her a shock of electricity. "Nathan said," starting her voice just above. He spoke hastily, his voice tinged with a whisper, "This we can't." I know, frustration, but it doesn't alter my perception that Jessica withdrew her hand as it caused a frenzied knot of terror, guilt, and something she couldn't bring herself to mention anything. She stood up suddenly, her chair scuffing the floor. Nathan didn't object, but the expression in his eyes when she added, "I think it's best if we both get some sleep." Long after she had shut the door to her bedroom, she left the room, and it lingered with her. Jessica's thoughts were racing while she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Refused to acknowledge the attraction she had for Nathan and how his presence appeared to fill a need. Although she wasn't even aware of it, she knew it was wrong, and however, the recollection of his words, voice, and touch remained when the house fell silent again, refusing to be pushed aside. Jessica rolled onto her side, gripping the pillow as though it might serve as a stabilizing anchor. Truth, but she knew in her heart that nothing would ever be the same. An invisible line had been crossed by something shifting, and there was no turning back. The days that followed the late-night kitchen chatter merged into an odd, unsettling cadence. Although Jessica was unable to determine the exact moment of the transition, the tension in the home had become uncontrollable. Longer than shyness, there was something more profound that hummed just below. The way Nathan looked at her was the surface of every conversation she had with him. Lingered a little too long, the way the silence between them made her pulse jump a beat whenever she heard his footfall. Appeared to express more than words could possibly express. Jessica attempted to occupy herself by hurling herself into tasks and errands, but the home itself appeared to work against her. The cramped walls, the trickle of even the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the floorboards seemed to magnify her thoughts, making it impossible for her to go. The recollection of their time spent together, she noticed that she was looking at the clock more frequently than she wanted to acknowledge. Pondering when she could see Nathan again, and whenever she heard his voice or the gentle sound of his footsteps, her heart would quicken in the distance, revealing feelings she didn't want to admit. That Jessica was casually folding in the living room one afternoon. Washing, the gentle golden light bathing the surface as the sun sank lower in the sky, giving it a warmth that contrasted with the inward chill of uncertainty. She was doing what she usually hated, folding a fitted sheet, when Nathan showed up in the doorway, his presence nearly palpable in the room, and he requested assistance. Jessica hesitated as the sheet slipped from her, her voice nonchalant but tinted with something she couldn't quite place. Hands as she turned to face him, confidently saying, at last, in a voice that was gentler than she. Nathan took a step forward as planned, moving slowly but deliberately. He reached for a stack of garments while sitting on the edge of the couch, his long legs extending, and Jessica started folding again. They worked in quiet for a while, her fingers fumbling with the fabric while the air seemed to thicken between them. Their motions had a nearly hypnotic rhythm, but Jessica couldn't help but notice how her senses appeared to heighten in his only a few feet away. She could feel the warmth of his body and the subtle aroma of his cologne. When their hands touched a t-shirt, Jessica heard the sound of his breathing and felt as she jerked her hand back as a spark flew through her like a live wire. Nathan froze, his eyes darting, as her breath caught in her throat out of instinct. His look was unreadable, so she apologized in a barely audible whisper. Nathan's words, "It's okay," were audible, but he kept his gaze fixed on hers, and the room briefly appeared to get smaller, with the distance between them getting narrower until Jessica's heart felt as though they were the only two individuals in the entire universe. I believe she sought to break the hold by racing her thoughts into a tangled mess. That's all, she murmured in a hurry, gathering the folded garments into a tidy pile, before standing suddenly and gripping the mound like a shield as she approached the corridor, but she was stopped by Nathan's voice. When Jessica heard her name lingering in the air like a slowly, as she faced him and tightened her hold on the clothing. I can't quit thinking about Nathan as he stood there, moving slowly and deliberately to close the gap between them. He spoke in a steady, quiet voice, and the words made me shudder. Her breath caught as she looked for any sign of reluctance on his face. There were indications that he wasn't serious, but Nathan wasn't present. Jessica started to tremble and scream, but he didn't ask him, and his eyes were focused. It's not that easy, she added, with only two people attempting to solve the problem. He broke his tone firmly, but she shook her head, saying, "You're not a kid anymore." Not to be rude, but you are aware that Jessica's cheeks reddened with a mix of shame, and she wanted to shove him away to stop something that she couldn't quite identify. The discussion before it got out of hand, but she was immobile and rooted to the spot. She was drawn in by his words and his presence. "Nathan, please, this isn't right." "Then why does it feel that way?" she asked, barely raising her voice above a whisper. "As it is," he retorted, moving in closer, till his palm touched hers. Jessica's breath caught her mind in a flurry of excitement after a brief but intense encounter. Emotions colliding in a way that left her feeling fearful, guilty, and desirous she murmured, "I need some air, I'm dizzy," removing her hand and turning to face the rear door, and as she walked out onto the porch, Jessica clutched the railing as the crisp evening air hit her like a wave. Her heart was pounding, and her head was racing as she struggled to calm herself. Replaying the exchange in vivid detail, she heard the door open a second later. Creak open behind her, and she knew it was Nathan without having to turn around because of his magnetic presence. Force that pulled her in, despite her want to shove him away. "I apologize if I caused you any discomfort," Nathan replied. I had to tell it in a quiet voice, and Jessica turned to face him while holding him in her arms. "You don't understand what you're asking," she replied, her voice tinged with fear, wrapping around herself as though to protect herself from the cold. Nathan may not have acknowledged approaching in desperation, but I understand how I feel. And I believe you do as well. Jessica's chest constricted as she threatened she wanted to refute it and tell him he was mistaken, but the words overwhelmed her. Wouldn't come, the truth was obviously hanging between them, and unavoidable. The quiet dragged on and intensified until Jessica at last she turned away, unable to keep his eyes on her. "I can't do this," she whispered. Nathan's voice broke, "I just can't." He nodded slowly, his emotions mixed. He murmured softly, "I'll give you space out of disappointment and understanding, but Jessica felt a pang as he turned and walked back inside, not moving. She stood on the porch for a long time, staring out of a sense of need she couldn't ignore. The distinction between good and wrong had never been clearer to her as the evening's weight weighed down on her at the fading horizon. Seemed so hazy and unmanageable, and she knew in her heart that this was just the start. Except for the gentle buzz of the television in the room, the home was silent that evening. Jessica sat on the soft couch in the living room, her body enveloped in an oversized. The soft material of her sweater and leggings isn't doing much to protect her from the impending storm. On the sofa table was a half-empty glass of ruby red wine. The movie that was playing, which caught the flickering light of the screen, was a romantic comedy that she had seen before. Numerous times, yet the happy moments seemed far away and unrelated to the strain. Nathan was sitting on the other end of the crackling air, so she wasn't alone. Couch, his body inclined toward her as though the distance between them were only a transient barrier. He arrived downstairs earlier without warning, but it wasn't shocking because they hadn't spoken much before a few nights before. They had a talk on the porch, but now, their quiet was different, charged like the calm. Jessica kept her eyes on the TV before a storm, but she wasn't paying attention. She couldn't help but notice Nathan's arm resting on the back of the couch and his knee brushing against hers when her heart pounded in her chest as he changed the delicate warmth of his presence. "Do you even enjoy how rhythm betrays the composed exterior?" she tried to keep up. Nathan asked abruptly in this movie, his voice breaking the silence, and Jessica looked at him in surprise. Although his tone was light-hearted, she could feel the intensity in his eyes. "Not really," she said, letting out a little trembling laugh. Nathan nodded, his eyes never leaving the room, just something to break the silence. "I understand that," he said gently, leaving hers. "Sometimes stillness can." Jessica turned back to the screen, feeling heavy, her cheeks flushed under she grabbed her wine glass and took a careful sip to settle herself under the weight of his gaze. Although the liquid was smooth and warm for her, it didn't do anything to slow the increasing. With a knot in her chest, she said, "I can change it if you want." Nathan shook his head, quieter now, almost hesitant, "But it's okay, I'm not really." Regardless, Jessica's fingers froze in mid-reach for the remote control as his words sank into her fingers were shaking a little as she put the remote control back on the table, feeling like stones. Now that the air was thicker, the space felt smaller, and she could sense the strain. Nathan moved closer to them as they developed an unspoken query that persisted in their shared area. Movement so delicate that it might have happened by accident, yet Jessica was aware of her. The slight touch of his arm against hers caused her pulse to speed, and she desired to get away from them, but her body deceived her, keeping her stationary. Jessica. Nathan spoke in a steady, low voice, and she turned by an unseen power. When her eyes met his, it appeared to him that everything else in the universe, the quiet hum of the kitchen refrigerator, fades away while the wine plays. Only the two of them remained in the dimly lit room after everything vanished. "I don't wish to unnerve you," he continued in a genuine tone, but I must know what you can feel. Jessica's thoughts racing and her breath getting stuck in her throat as she looked for a response, wanting to tell him he was dreaming, but the truth was glaring back at her. She felt the tug of it in her face. Ignite the inexplicable link that defied sense and explanation. When she turned away, her hands twisted in her lap, her voice shaking as she tried to find the right words to say to Nathan. "It's complimentary, but it doesn't have to be," he stated, occasionally using a hard yet gentle tone. "Things simply happen, and even while they may not be what we anticipated, that doesn't lessen their significance." The weight of his words broke something inside of Jessica that she had spent so much time working on, and her eyes began to well up with tears. Long attempting to conceal her feelings in order to preserve a controllable facade, but now that he is being honest with her, she responded, "Nathan, you don't understand," as she felt the barriers she had put up around herself start to come down. Voice shaking, "There are repercussions for this, it's not simply about sentiments." "I know," he said, his eyes unblinking, "but I also know that we can't take anything back." Jessica glanced at him and realized that denying it wouldn't make it go away. She could feel the genuine sorrow and vulnerability in his eyes, which hurt from the weight of their shared silence. She was trying so hard to keep it in check when she realized she wasn't alone. Nathan extended his hand and hovered above a woman engaged in a conflict she couldn't win. When his fingers finally touched her, she didn't move away because he hesitated just above hers. Her faint contact sent a shock, like if a spark had been kindled. Of energy flowing through her, the gap between them vanished in a split second. Jessica wasn't sure who made the first move, but all of a sudden they were closer than before, their breaths blending in. Nathan's soft, steady touch on her cheek triggered the electrified air. "Tell me to stop," he said, grounding her in an unavoidable yet bizarre moment. His speech was almost audible, and Jessica's heart was racing as she looked into his eyes. Was on the verge of making a choice she couldn't reverse, so she opened her mouth to speak, but she leaned into him and touched her own hand instead of saying anything. Finding its way to his lips, the initial kiss was tentative, a gentle kiss that it was a kiss full of unspoken feelings that sent shockwaves through her entire soul. Feelings, a silent admission of all they had been too scared to express, and as it grew more intense, the previously impenetrable walls between them are disintegrating under the weight of their shared. Jessica's breath came in shallow gasps as they finally withdrew, her head racing as she attempted to process the need. Nathan's eyes were closed as he leaned his forehead against hers, reflecting on what had just transpired. Was also having trouble understanding everything. "I apologize," he added softly. "I didn't want this to occur, Jessica, and I'm feeling both sorrow and longing." "Don't apologize," she replied, shaking her head but keeping her hands on his. "Hardly more than a whisper. I'm not sure what this implies, but I can't act." Nathan nodded, his face conflicted but resolute, "But it didn't happen." Despite the internal maelstrom, he spoke steadily as he said, "Figure it out." The world outside appeared to hold its breath as they sat there in the dimly illuminated chamber, anticipating what would come next, and Jessica couldn't get rid of the impression that this was only the start. The first rays of sunlight trickled through the surface of something much more complex than either of them could have ever imagined. Jessica lay on her side with her body still, the translucent curtains in her bedroom illuminating the space with a golden glow. And her thoughts were racing while she gazed at the dim designs the morning light had created on the wall. The air felt heavy, as though the home it was holding its breath, and every sound seemed to intensify the slightest. The continuous hum of an automobile engine, the distant chirp of birds outdoors, and the pounding. She had not slept well, and the previous night's events replayed on a loop in her head, so vivid and unavoidable that her lips continued to quiver from the warmth of Nathan's touch, and the memory of his kiss clung to her skin like the boundary they had crossed was so faint that she couldn't shake the echo. Undefined before felt audacious and obviously impossible to ignore. Jessica as she rolled onto her back, placing her hands on her stomach and gazing up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what had occurred, pressing down on her, making it difficult for her to breathe. She was unsure of what followed by advice on how to face the day knowing what they have done. The idea of meeting Nathan again made her feel a jumble of mixed feelings, including love and fear. The delicate silence of the morning was broken by a gentle knock on the door, which she was unable to comprehend. She didn't have to guess who it was since her breath caught in her throat as she sat up, her heart racing. She tried to compose herself by running a hand through her unkempt hair. Jessica. Nathan spoke softly and hesitantly, even while her thoughts were racing. But with a sense of urgency that caused her heart to race for a brief minute, she thought about acting as though she hadn't heard him. Allowing him to believe she was still asleep, but she was unable to permanently escape this. She slid her legs over the edge of the bed and got up after taking a big breath. "Come in," she said steadily, her bare feet slipping into the velvety carpet. The door slowly opened, and Nathan went through it despite the fury roaring inside of her. He appeared restless on the inside, as she could feel by his disheveled hair and his attitude. Uncertain, he looked into her eyes, and for a few periods, neither of them spoke. The air was heavy with Nathan finally spoke in the morning, stating everything they hadn't said. Early in the morning, Jessica crossed her arms over her head and responded in a cautious tone. Chest immediately realized how exposed she felt while wearing her baggy t-shirt, and Nathan wore leggings as he moved farther into the space and shut the door. Gesture felt personal, as if they were separating themselves from the others. He hesitated and pushed his hands into his pockets. "Sweatpants," he started, his voice trailing off, before continuing to talk about last night. Jessica turned away from her cheeks as though he was unsure of how to finish the thought. "We don't need to discuss it," since she was blushing and couldn't bring herself to look him in the eyes for fear of what she would see. Nathan made a mistake when she spoke too hastily and sharply. He echoed, flinching as the phrase sliced through the air like a razor. "Is that what you believe his tone to be, somewhere between hurt and disbelief?" Jessica's nails dug into her palms as she tightened her fists at her sides. Didn't want to downplay what had transpired, but what option did she have? Yes, she stated that it shouldn't have happened to force the word out. Nathan took a he's clearly frustrated. "You can't act as though it didn't happen." "Mean anything," he said, his tone was forceful, "and I'm sure you felt it too." When he insisted on it, Jessica's gaze jerked to his, her rage erupting. "Regardless of my feelings," she shot back, because we both know that Nathan's his hands clenched into fists, and his jaw hardened. "Perhaps this wasn't right," he acknowledged. His tone softened, but that didn't imply it wasn't genuine. His words' honesty took the wind out of her sails. Jessica collapsed onto the bed's edge, her shoulders hunching under the strain. "Nathan," she whispered softly, her voice shaking, settling over her again. "Can't happen again," so he took a seat next to her, giving her adequate room. He remarked in a soft tone, "I don't want to make things harder for you," to give the impression that the gap was intentional. "But after this, Jessica, I can't just go back to how things were." "We have to," she replied, looking down at her hands, which were twisted together as she battled to find the appropriate words. "Finally, there is nothing we can do," because Nathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he gazed at the screen while leaning forward and putting his elbows on his knees. After a lengthy silence, he said, "I'm not sure I can," not knowing how the unfiltered sincerity in his words made Jessica's heart hurt. Out to console him, but she was unable to trust every touch and glance. Felt like she was getting closer to a precipice she wasn't prepared to fall over. Although her voice lacked conviction, she stated, "We'll figure it out, but for the time being, we must maintain our distance." Nathan gave a hesitant nod, but his face was everything but resigned. He answered, "That's what you want, but I need you to understand that this won't simply go away, not for me." Jessica observed him as he turned to leave the room, the door clicking behind him, and the ensuing quiet was unbearable. She reclined on the couch with the weight of his words still hanging over her bed, gazing up at the ceiling while her mind continued to wander throughout the day. Jessica was aware of the hours that were ahead, which were intimidating and unpredictable. Would be full of phony grins and courteous exchanges, while she had no idea what lay ahead as their tension boiled beneath the surface. But there was no doubt that nothing would ever be the same. Once more,